Our tale takes place in the 19th century. We are talking Burial of the Rats. This is a 1995 movie produced by Roger Corman and directed by Dan Golden. It's got a recognisable female cast in Adrienne Barbeau, Maria Ford, and small roles for Nikki Fritz and Leona Quigley. Now this is based on a story from Bram Stoker, and Bram Stoker actually features as our male lead character. And it's essentially a kind of 19th century battle of the sexes movie. We essentially have Bram Stoker and his father travelling across some country. It looks like it's supposed to be France. This was actually filmed in Russia. It never actually specifically says it's in France, but some of the the costuming and the stuff like that lends itself to kind of 19th century France. But anyway, they are attacked by a group of hooded bandits, initially they think, and Bram Stoker is captured. And it turns out there is an all-female cult of warrior women led by Adrienne Barbeau, who has the ability to control rats. And these women hate men. That's their basic kind of reason for being. They have formed this cult, if you like, this group, all because they have been somehow wronged by men and have cultivated this kind of hatred and ultimately want to kill any type of kind of male they come across. However, Maria Ford's character ends up kind of falling for Bram Stoker, and she kind of convinces the Queen to kind of keep him alive because he's a writer. He can kind of write about their kind of exploits and ultimately then kind of inspire fear in all men. And as it transpires, there's a variety of kind of clashes and kind of, loyalties are tested, and what will happen, you'll have to watch the movie and find out. So this is a made-for-TV movie, and yes, it is a B-movie. It's kind of very schlocky, very kind of silly, but kind of fun. I will say that. What can we say in the plus column for this film? So yeah, I've got to say, this is kind of a fun, silly movie. Obviously, we have, warrior women dressed up in kind of like fur bikinis with sword. Clearly very impractical, clearly obviously made for the male gaze here. Lots of kind of nudity. This was kind of, as I say, filmed in Russia, and they hired a lot of kind of like Russian locals to essentially kind of run around kind of semi-naked and things like that in the kind of the background. But there's lots of kind of like flesh on display here. And Maria Ford is absolutely mesmerising in this role, I have to say. Obviously they're in films before, but she is like drop dead gorgeous in this movie, I have to say. As our kind of our good girl Madeline, and then she has her kind of counterpart, Anna, who's jealous ultimately of kind of the attention that she's getting from the Bram Stoker character, and there's the subtext there. There's kind of lesbian kind of lust and things like this. So I actually kind of quite like some of the kind of the fun, kind of silly elements in this movie, despite it clearly not being a movie that's taken itself particularly kind of seriously. There are kind of a few kind of comedic moments, not out and out comedy, but certainly there are a couple of comedic moments. I think the choice here to film this in Russia gives it this kind of like rustic kind of European feel. There's a great sequence in a kind of a torture chamber, kind of a dungeon. We have old kind of like ruins and kind of castles as kind of backdrops and things like that. So I thought that was really good. Like I said, I quite enjoyed this kind of like 19th century French aesthetic. That was quite fun. So the costuming stuff here was all pretty good. I have to say as well, we do have a reasonable amount of kind of sword fights in this movie, and I was surprised at the kind of the level of choreography on some of the kind of the sword fights here. I thought they were done very well. I know that was quite good. You buy into the relationship between Madeline, who played by Maria Ford, and kind of the Bram Stoker character. And one of the things I liked about the kind of the Bram Stoker character here is you're not quite sure where his loyalties lie, because he's obviously taken prisoner. He's separated from his father, and he does make a couple of attempts to kind of reach out and try and contact his father. But you do feel his loyalties are kind of somewhat kind of split. Is he somewhat kind of loyal to this this clan of women who seem to hate all other men, and him to a degree, or is he trying to ultimately escape because his growing affections to the Madeline character seems to kind of want him to keep him around, and he acts like he somewhat respects these women as well. So I quite like the fact that the Stoker character, you never really know really where he would actually kind of like choose to kind of like lay his hat, so to speak, given the kind of the choice. I mean, ultimately he's somewhat of a prisoner, but you know, he seems relatively kind of happy there. You know, it's a relatively kind of brisk film. It's cheesy. It's a cheesy movie, but it's still kind of quite fun, and you know, it has that kind of fantasy kind of movie vibe to a certain degree, despite it being kind of set at least in 19th century Europe somewhere, and not really having kind of magic or anything like that outside of kind of like Adrian Barbeau's ability to control the rats. The rats don't get a huge amount of screen time. There's a little bit of gore here. It kind of feels like, you know, obviously they didn't have a lot of money to do that sort of thing. And it's quite amusing. The rats will set up on a person, and the next scene there'll be kind of like just a completely bare skeleton and things like that. Okay, so let's talk about what doesn't work. Yeah, it's a cheesy B movie. If you're wanting a story which doesn't have any kind of silly nonsense in it, you're not going to find it here, because this movie, I mean, the whole premise is a battle of their sexes, and we have these women running around in kind of fur bikinis with swords and things like this against the kind of like the stuffy men in their kind of like 19th century kind of like army gear and things like this. It's kind of like very, very silly and very, very schlocky. As I've mentioned, this was filmed in Russia, so the main cast clearly English speaking, Marie Ford, Adrian Barbeau. But there's obviously other actors who are hired locally, and they've kind of been overdubbed. So the acting comes across as silly, as a little bit kind of cheesy, and kind of like hokey at times. And the whole movie really has a kind of a somewhat of a kind of hokey feel. I mean, outside of the bit I've mentioned, where you're not really sure where Bram Stoker's kind of loyalties kind of lie, you know, the rest of the characters are relatively kind of paper thin. Adrian Barbeau, I have to be honest with you, is somewhat wasted here. She's more or less just sitting on the throne the entire kind of time, either sitting on the throne or sitting at the kind of dinner table, and that's kind of all she really does. We don't really see her get too involved with the story, despite her actually being top billing in this movie. She isn't the kind of the female lead, or even the kind of like the secondary female lead. That's the Anna character. So I think they could have had used Adrian Barbeau a little better here, be a little bit more kind of integrated kind of in the story and kind of things like that. There's wobbly kind of like props and things like this, giant kind of axes that are clearly kind of made of foam. We see the kind of the you know, the sets kind of move around a couple of times and things like this. So yeah, there's a cheapness to this movie, and it's a little bit dark in regards to kind of some of the cinematography. You know, I understand that this was filmed in kind of Russia, and apparently it was kind of winter when it was being filmed, so there's some logistical problems there, but it comes across as sometimes it's a little bit sort of dark and dingy looking. It works fine in some sequences with the dungeon, but others are a little underlit at times. Yeah, and it's just that obviously clearly the whole thing's very, very silly, a very loose adaptation. But nonetheless, I've got to be honest with you, I actually found this movie quite charming. It was actually a lot better than I had thought it was going to be. I hadn't seen this one before. So I quite enjoyed it. If you going knowing that this is a silly, hokey movie, and clearly would be problematic by today's standards, you know, there it is. But I think you can kind of have some fun with it. It does have this kind of like this battle of the kind of the sexes, obviously, as this kind of main theme here. And again, had this been made more recently, there might have been some more nuance in here. There is a little bit, you know, we kind of get a little bit of backstory about how some of these women are abused, and we see some kind of like some smaller parts from men, you know, touching up young girls and things like that. So but it doesn't really kind of have any kind of real genuine sort of dramatic edge to that, if that makes sense. It's really just kind of like window dressing. But I've got to be honest, like I said, I had fun with it. I'll give it a 6 out of 10 actually. If you're happy watching a B movie and you know you're going to go into watching some exploitation schlock, I think you can do worse. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.